Good morning. Just by way of housekeeping, there is a sign-in sheet for Dr. Sherman's class back there, but if you're in class, you do not need to sign in. Follow directions on Halo to earn the makeup points that you're looking for. I've been given the honor of emceeing this event by my colleagues here, so thank you guys for having me come and do this. My name is Dr. Linnell Mason. I am an instructor of philosophy and Christian worldview here. Some of you I'm familiar with because you're in my classes, so thank you for showing up. Just a little bit of a personal story and kind of background in the book. When I came to GCU about 3 years ago in the fall of 2022, these guys have been working on the book that we're going to be talking about today for already about 2 years. And I remember them kind of working on this with blood and sweat and tears for the last...
a lot of tears.
For the whole time that I've actually been here. And so coming here as a brand new professor, I didn't actually taught anywhere prior to this, at least not to this extent, of teaching undergraduate general ed classrooms philosophy, I had a lot to learn. And one of the things that you quickly learn when you teach philosophy to such a classroom is how difficult philosophy is actually to teach. For one thing, it's quite difficult to even define philosophy for students, and so that's why I quite like how they define philosophy in the book as thinking really hard about really important topics, right? But even if we have such a definition of philosophy, we still kind of run into two difficult issues when trying to teach philosophy. One is, what are the important questions? Right? How do we actually define what is important to think about versus what is not important to think about? Because if we think about philosophy broadly, there's a lot of things that I would argue that isn't that important to think about that philosophers try to think about. So trying to find those core issues that we think are important for students to know in an introductory way. And then the other challenge is trying to communicate what is important about those issues so that students can then think about them in a way that's productive for them and helps them understand the issue in a deeper way. And I go on this rant about my challenge of becoming a brand new philosophy instructor just to say that what they have done here in writing this introductory philosophy book is really special because it does those two things quite well. It picks out the very important issues for Christians to think about and in philosophy, and then also presents them in a way that even if you didn't know anything about philosophy, you would be able to think productively about them. So I congratulate you guys on your new book. That is amazing. Just a round of applause as we start.
Thank you.
So I have the honor of introducing my colleagues who will be talking about their book. Unfortunately, one of them is not here, one of the authors, and that is Peter J. Razor II, who's a senior pastor at Littleburn Christian Church in Littleburn, Georgia. He's also an adjunct for GCU. But who is here? To begin, Dr. Stephen B. Sherman is Associate Professor of Philosophy and the course lead for philosophy. He also teaches philosophy of religion for the philosophy minor program. So many of you probably had him as a professor more than once. And then also Christian apologetics at the seminary. We have Gary S. Osmundson, or Dr. O, or as I like to call him, Good Guy Gary, who's Assistant Professor of Philosophy.
Never heard that.
Not only the Introduction to Philosophy class, but also the Knowledge and Reality class. And my students who've had Gary are huge fans. So just saying that, Gary. And then we have Richard A. Holland Jr. as Assistant Professor of Philosophy and taught various philosophy and apologetics courses here and other institutions of higher learning. And then moderating for us today is Dan Diffie. Daniel Diffie serves as Department Chair of the Bachelor of Arts in Christian Studies program and is Professor of Old Testament and Hebrew at Grand Canyon University. And they're going to be discussing Introduction to Philosophy, new book just published and released by Zondervan. So thank you guys for coming. I'll hand this back over to Dan. Round of applause again.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mason.
Appreciate it.
So, writing a textbook or any book is not an easy task, and so what they've done with one of the most prominent publishers in the Christian sphere is really amazing. And I love the subtitle, A Christian Guide, The Things That Really Matter. And so as we open up, I just have a general question. How did your introduction to philosophy textbook come about?
Well, about 5 years ago, as I was looking back at the dates, maybe even just a little click beyond that, we were in the middle of revising the Phi 103 course. How many of you guys have had or are having Phi 103? Okay, so you know the course now. And up here at GCU, we revise courses on a regular basis. And as we were looking for textbooks, updating, possible textbooks that we could use to update the current one we use, it was a struggle, frankly. That's how this ended up happening. Is we talked together and we said, there really isn't anything that covers all the bases. There's many books that cover some of the bases, but we have some other ideas. And so we put our heads together, brainstormed a bit, and began to go down that journey and met with a couple of different publishers that we respect. And frankly, Zondervan was a perfect fit. When you know that match is there, go with it. And it was just there. And so that was ideas 5 years ago. And then what happened in 2020? Masks, COVID, all of this. And so we had to sort of delay some things because of a different way in which we had to teach courses for that year. And just everything was in a shakeup. So we basically had to not quite take a year off, but close. And then we got into the meat of it. So it was 4 of us that had come together thinking about different areas of our studies, our interests, expertise, and all that, and began to write toward that. So with that, I'll pass it on to more reflection.
Any other comments on how the book came about?
Yeah, I guess just to add one thing along with what you were saying, Steve, is that, a lot of philosophy textbooks are either too superficial or they're too long and detailed, and it's difficult, I think, to find something that really works. Ultimately, we wrote the book because we couldn't find anything else out there that really spoke to students like we have here at GCU.
All right.
You are our target audience, really, honestly. We have 3 major audiences that we thought about, and you're number 1, traditional undergraduate students who are looking for something that could be useful for their lives, not just for knowledge about these topics, but truly usable in your life. We all believe that philosophy is only as good as it can be lived out. And so, again, that's part of our basis for that.
Yeah. And in the vein of what you and Rich just said, what are some of the unique things that this textbook provides that other comparable philosophy textbooks don't?
One of the things that jumps out to me is that many of the philosophy textbooks that are available have in things like examples or explanations, they do things in a way that's not exactly friendly to Christianity. Not necessarily overtly anti-Christian or anything like that, but just sort of the subtle digs and, the biases that come out. And I think one of the things we tried to do was not necessarily produce, sort of the opposite. We didn't want to become unfriendly to some other audience, but we wanted to sort of correct that and make a book that really addressed, like we say, the subtitle, these things the way Christians would think about them.
As you look at our chapters, you'll see we have 26 or 26 chapters in 8 different parts. And those are broken down into traditional topics, logic, epistemology, metaphysics, and moral philosophy or ethics. Of course, it has to be in a philosophy textbook, but we do some things that are really different from that we feel connects with where students are at and what they need to understand about morality or about meaning and purpose in life or their mental life, etc., that kind of go beyond normal textbooks. And we felt these are things that we do in the class anyway at times, at least in our different contexts. And so we felt that to leave that out would just not be sufficient. And I think Dr. O may be talking about one of those here soon.
Yeah, as you look through that table of contents that you mentioned, there are a lot of interesting chapters in here, but one of them is on cognitive distortions.
Yeah.
Why did you decide to include that in an introduction to philosophy textbook?
Yeah, so again, going back to the definition of philosophy, thinking hard about things that really matter. And it turns out that thinking is really important to think about. And so, having taught here now almost 10 years, I was aware of some of the studies and literature on the poor mental health that's currently taking place within the country. And so, for example, you look at the National Institute of Mental Health. They say more than 1 in 5 people suffer from some mental illness. And then you target it down to college students, and the Center for Collegiate Mental Health, they did a study involving over 160 colleges and universities, and 20 to 35% of the students in a given year are candidates for some sort of mental health intervention, therapy. And so when we teach logic, I want to immune my students from being the victims from informal fallacies, which are ways to get them to believe things on the basis of inadequate evidence. But I realized that they too were sort of victims of their own patterns of thinking that resulted in beliefs about themselves that are that ends up being the culprit of a lot of unnecessary stress, anxiety, and depression. And so I thought that if we studied these particular patterns of reasoning, which is just a subset of other patterns of reasoning you would see in logic, students could really see just how practical philosophy can be. And so, yeah, I felt like just what I knew, what was happening in literature, and just anecdotally in the classroom. Because when I started to introduce these things, I would start to receive anecdotal evidence of how beneficial this was, because a lot of my students are freshmen, and so they're coming in. It's their first time away from home. They're in a new environment. They're in a new chapter of life, and that is an immediate stressor. It generates a lot of anxiety, and so just teaching them how to catch these distorted patterns of thinking really give them some tools and some confidence that they don't have to succumb to some of these results that come with distorted ways of forming beliefs.
I want to mention on that too, because Dr. O wrote that chapter. This is one of those integrated chapters, right? That you're not pulling from one particular academic field or discipline or something. This has philosophy, psychology, sociology, athletics. I mean, it's very significantly interrelated to different disciplines and different practices. So you're pulling out some of the best psychologists today, so on as well, that provide us great insight into who we are.
Yeah, and because of the diverse student profile we have here, you can benefit from that chapter, as a non-Christian, but as a Christian, you might be thinking, what's this have to do with the Christian life? Well, I don't think the evidence in that chapter is many 2 steps away removed from the kind of things that Paul's saying in 2 Corinthians 10:5 and taking every thought captive for Christ, or, being transformed by the renewing of your mind in Romans 12:2. I mean, I think that's just part of recognizing how much the battle of being able to live life well takes place in the mind.
Thank you. And as all of you teach Phi and Phi 103, Philosophy 103 in an introduction class, I'm sure you have to give an apologetic for why is thinking about and studying philosophy important? And is it only important to those people who are interested in the topic of learning philosophy?
Yeah, no, that's not only for those. I mean, you're right. I think there is a sense in which at least I feel the weight of this on the first day of class or whatever. You feel like you have to, like you said, make an apologetic for why this stuff is important. But I hope that it doesn't take too many, weeks into the semester for the average student who's paying attention to quickly realize why studying philosophy is important. I mean, the most prominent thing that comes to my mind is, and I guess maybe this is a cliche thing to say, but I think it's true. If you begin to understand what philosophy is, everyone will also understand that you're already doing philosophy. You're already doing it. And so the question is, are you doing it very well? So everybody who shows up to our classrooms, they think that they have the ability to, for example, reason through problems and come up with good answers logically. They make claims to have knowledge. They think that they know things about a wide variety of subjects. They think they act as if they have free will. They think they have a mind that isn't quite the same thing as their body, or we could just go down the list of all the different things we address in a class like Philosophy 103 and the list of topics we address in the book. And if you're a human person, you're already engaged with these things. So like what I would try to do in the classroom and what we're trying to accomplish through our book in part is really just sort of bring to light all the important ideas that are related to these things that we're already doing with a mind toward helping people do them better, to do them well. Philosophy is for everybody who's a human person. The other thing maybe, and then I'll let my colleagues talk about this, I guess, the other thing too is inherently philosophy as a discipline, it's sort of like the study of everything. Like you were saying a minute ago about this cognitive distortions chapter and how it's very integrative. And that's very much the case. Pick a field of study in a major discipline anywhere on this campus or at any university, anywhere. And there are going to be major assumptions that are made before that discipline gets started. Those major assumptions require a very robust work in philosophy to get to those assumptions first. Mm-hmm. So in many ways, every other subject matter depends on really good philosophy.
To say it's for multiple audiences is true. I'm so happy to see. I talked to my mother. She's in California every day, and I gave her a copy of the book and thought, it'd go on the shelf. And all of a sudden she goes, you know what? I'm really learning a lot here. And she began to dive in to a couple of these chapters that we've talked off the cuff, but 85 years old and excited about some new material, but not sort of bizarre stuff that's off the scale for her. It's instead, she's like, this stuff makes sense for my life, and that's exactly what we are thinking when we're writing it. It doesn't matter what our topic is. I mean, deductive and inductive logic and reasoning, Dr. Holland's writing, but the examples and the method within there, anybody can see how valuable it is to thinking deeply about all kinds of different problems in our world, in our faith, and our relationship with others. So it's not something for just undergraduate students who are taking philosophy course. No, that's not it at all. In fact, a couple days we'll talk to pastors about this, because we feel like if a pastor's already prepared, wonderful. If not, they don't have this background, this underlying understanding of these key topics, they can put it on the shelf and go to as need be, or perhaps give themselves a deeper basis for reasoning about what they're teaching and so on.
So why do you think a philosophy of the mind is so important to answering the question of what is a human person?
I think the philosophy of mind is so important to answering that question because it really gets at the kind of evidence that not only gives important clues to unlock the mystery of what a human person is, I actually think it provides evidence to unlock and provide clues to the nature of reality. I think the problem with getting people to see the importance of this is when it comes to consciousness, we're so familiar with it that it's kind of like getting fish excited about water. It's like, hey, there's this really cool emergent property that happens when you combine water molecules together and wetness emerges. You're just like, what? Wetness? Like, big deal. But when someone takes the time to look at the mind-body problem, and there's several, right? I list 5 in that chapter. It really provides evidence for understanding some of the essential properties that make a human person the kind of thing that they are. And when I say essential, I mean if you lose these things, you lose the person, as opposed to a non-essential property like hair follicles. I've lost some and I'm still here. But you lose some essential properties like the power and capacity for consciousness, right? And you're gone. That's usually an important criterion for death. But part of the project behind this book is to help people build a better worldview, and the kind of evidence you get from the philosophy of mind really contributes to that. And if you're a Christian, it's a treasure trove of evidence that supports the Imago Dei, in my estimation. So one of my former professors and mentors, J.P. Moreland, he wrote the foreword to this book, talks about the recalcitrant Imago Dei. In fact, that's a title of one of his books. And when you compare the Christian worldview to alternative ones, specifically naturalism, there should be things true about Christian anthropology that resists a naturalistic definition and understanding of a human person. And so the philosophy of mind gives you evidence to really help you answer the question, what's a human person? But it also helps you better understand, I think, the nature of reality, because everyone's worldview's got a beginning and open chapter that begins with the words, in the beginning was. And you're either left with matter, you got the atomic BBs, abstract objects, or you have mind. And it's really encouraging today to just see even naturalists and atheists begin to recognize that it seems, for some, right, that consciousness just seems fundamental, right? And the Christians over here are saying, we've always said that. In the beginning was mind, was God. And it's just nice to see an independent source of evidence and discipline support that.
So it seems that a lot of colleges and university programs, they include their own ethics courses today rather than ethics being taught within the framework of theology or philosophy. It's interesting that you've chosen to include bioethics, sexual ethics, and communication and information ethics in your textbook. Why was that important?
Before we became philosophers, all of us had prior lives, right? So we were involved in full-time business or military or other activities where we always experienced, as you do in your life here and life outside of here, moral decisions, moral philosophies, if you will, that are abundant and everywhere and very different in different contexts. So I think of the business world, I think of growing up a communications major and going into, my areas, broadcasting and things like that. And at every turn, as a new believer in that sense, there was always an opportunity always a challenge on how I'm going to respond or what I'm going to say about something. But the cultures themselves seem to have an ongoing, whether it was stated explicitly or implicitly, a moral or ethical core, to every cultural context I was in. And so writing about this, part of the reasoning is because I have seen a decline. I think all of us would agree, I won't speak for you, but a massive decline, a massive separation between philosophy and ethics today in our culture. Most people, frankly, in our culture have no interest in the former, and they're deeply interested in the latter. And so what has happened is this severing between what has always been part of philosophy, which is ethics. That's why it's called what? Moral philosophy historically. It's the moral part, the ethics part of philosophy, of the deep questions, the most important things in our lives. What is good? What is evil? What is right and what is wrong? But today, instead, it's compartmentalized into things like what? Business ethics, education ethics, technology ethics, and the philosophy part is oftentimes completely whitewashed. We felt that that was not a good thing, especially if the underlying worldview, which there will be one, is purposefully hidden from people. And just a core set of maybe 3 or 4 principles that sort of guide the day for that area. And so we wrote it because we feel like it is ethics or moral philosophy is necessarily connected to thinking hard about important things, about the things that really matter. And Christianly, for us, is crucial as well. We all are firm believers in the authority of the biblical text. You'll find that in the reading. We also believe in all the essential orthodox truths about God as triune and Jesus Christ as Savior and Lord and fully God, fully human. And so those things guide us. So when we hear the word, what is the greatest commandment? Greatest commandments, love the Lord your God with all you are, and love others as yourself or neighbors as yourself. We don't take that as an option, and that's central to who we are. And so we write the book with the idea that real moral philosophy has to come from real moral authority, not from a subjective personal experience of how I feel or think about gender or sexuality or bioethics or technology or communication. Nobody tell me what to do with my phone. It's mine. I can do what I want, when I want, where I want, how I want, right? That's led to so many problems in your life and my life statistically, right? So maybe you're not struggling with moral issues. I can't imagine it, but I guess I need your counsel. Okay. And we all do. And so we felt it was important to cover, remember, it's an introduction, so we're not getting to the heavy details of these things. But we do cover some really, I think, interesting reports, data sets, facts, along with our underlying moral understanding of God's will for us in all of those areas. And particularly for me in the sexual ethics arena and the communication and information ethics areas.
If I can jump in too real quick, I'm going to give an example. My background, my undergraduate degree is in mechanical engineering, and I had to take a class where I went to university. I had to take a class called Engineering Ethics. And I can imagine it's similar to what somebody might take in a business ethics class or a whatever, healthcare ethics. I can promise you we did no moral philosophy in that class, none at all. Instead, what that class was about was there was an array of assumptions that came into the class on the first day, and then it was all about how you should design airplanes and bridges and buildings given certain assumptions about moral values. So it really ended up being like a morals, do this, don't do that, do this, don't do that. It was that kind of a class. So for example, in that class, it wasn't explicit, but one of the underlying assumptions was that human persons are valuable. But at no point did anybody ever ask or address the question, why should we think that human persons are valuable, right? And this is the kind of thing that happens whenever you separate ethics from philosophy. When you compartmentalize it and put it down into a major specific or a career specific field, it just ends up being accepted standards of conduct with no consideration of the more fundamental questions. And I think that's why we need to be doing ethics in the context of philosophy as opposed to these other separate fields.
I'm going to ask also on that, Rich, if we can ask each other. So how does that work, too, in terms of subjective ethics, right? Very different from this corporate idea that you had of here's right, here's wrong, here's what you do. What about this subjectivity level that's so rampant in our culture today on this?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a good answer except to say, like in my engineering class, it's sort of like this is just how we do things, right? Without really any consider. And you can imagine, like, I don't know, what professions are there where you have to get, besides engineering, where you have to get a license and you have to answer to a board of professional standards of conduct and things like that. It sort of becomes less of this is right and wrong and this is why we're doing it, and more of this is just the way we do things here. So it becomes like, accepted standards as opposed to being anchored into rightness or wrongness of things.
I can't help but thinking that's we do us.
Yeah, you do you, we do us. Yeah.
Rather than you do you, which is the subjective side.
Yeah, and if you think about it, unless you're doing the philosophy, you never have any basis of complaining against the licensing board, right? If there's a bad accepted standard, unless you're doing good moral philosophy, you have no right to complain about that bad standard. You just have to live with it. But when you go into doing the good work and you start to think about the objective rightness or wrongness of things, then you have a basis that you can build on to figure out what your standards of conduct ought to be.
So one of the parts in the book is on logic, reasoning, and arguments. So why is logic, why is reasoning, why is argumentation important?
One of the biggest reasons why I think it's important to study logic is because everybody in this room, you've all arrived here today with a set of beliefs about really important things. And you believe them. If you didn't believe them, you'd believe something else, right? So the fact that you believe them is one way of saying that as you currently sit right now, you are convinced that they are true. The problem is that if you are convinced that it is true, you are very likely to accept and use really bad reasoning to support those beliefs for no other reason that you already think that those beliefs are true. So you present an argument with a series of premises and the conclusion, therefore, this belief I have is true. You're going to ignore the argument and you're going to evaluate it only on the basis of the conclusion says what you want it to say, right? The conclusion affirms what you currently believe, and so you're going to think that's a great argument because the conclusion of that argument is what I already believe. Yeah. So one of the reasons why we study logic is to help check ourselves against those built-in biases that we have. And maybe my belief is true, maybe it's false, but sort of a bare minimum first step is I have to take a good hard look at my own reasoning process to see whether I'm reasoning well, if my reasoning makes any sense, or if I'm thinking correctly about the stuff.
That's well said, Rich. It makes me think of the late Dallas Willard, who used to say how so often students and people in general encounter an argument and they go right to the conclusion and then they evaluate it by consulting their stomachs.
Whoa, pretty hard.
And if it sits well, it's a good argument. if it's a bad visceral reaction, it's a bad argument. And, you know, that's fine at Baskin Robbins when you're trying to, you know, take out the little spoons and
Sounds good.
test different ice creams. But if you want to get to the truth, you need to learn how to evaluate that argument. And the only way to do that is to first learn about the tools of logic to do so.
And really, part of that doesn't begin and end with Socrates or even with Aristotle or even with Aquinas. You guys have been studying them, but really, to me, Jesus, the logician, Jesus, the reasoner, is real and true as well. We have to go to the source of the authority for what's true. And the arguments that Jesus makes are incredible. He uses a fortiori arguments, he uses modus ponens, modus tollens, hypothetical syllogisms, all kinds of stuff. Constructive dilemmas, or at least initiates those, so that you don't have to think, oh, I don't want to use those arguments because they have nothing to do with my faith. Well, if your faith is really wrapped up in God and who Christ is, of course they do. You want to know why he uses hypotheticals and such. You want to understand how he uses both deductive and inductive kinds of reasoning and catches people in their informal fallacies regularly. It's a great study about the person of Christ himself, too. And although we don't cover a whole lot of that in the text, we sort of lean toward that so you can do some of your studies in that area, too.
So my daughter has picked up the guitar. She's 16 years old. She plays the guitar, and in order to play the guitar and really play it and make music, as opposed to obnoxious sounds, it requires a good bit of diligent study about the instrument and the method of playing the instrument to produce the beautiful sounds. Well, in a manner of speaking, this is how we ought to approach logic. God has made us to be we don't just pick up reasoning on the weekends and do it with our friends. God has made us intrinsically logicians. We are rational creatures with a common sense, with rational faculties that are essential for our function as human persons in the world. And so to make the beautiful music that is flourishing as a human, as opposed to obnoxious sounds that happen in the dorm room debates, you've got to study how to do that well, what it is to be a thinker, and how it is our reasoning faculties are designed to function so that we can do it well. Ultimately, as Gary said, we arrive at truth so that we can flourish as humans.
That's a lot of what we do in the classroom, too. You know, you guys know that with our big Qs that we do in my class, and then we do all kinds of different projects as well. The book itself is set up for you to be able to utilize some of those kinds of techniques. We have for further research. We also have questions for reflection. There's material available for you to carry on, and a lot of resources, too. So don't forget to check the footnotes. Because we had to keep the book a certain length, we spent a lot of time putting things into footnotes that, quote, kind of don't really count as much for page count. So those areas are where you can dive in a lot deeper, what we're talking about here, and examples and such, too.
We didn't mention this earlier, but now that you're saying that, it reminds us one of the benefits of our book, I think, compared to other books, is that they're digestible chapters. I mean, you pick up some of these textbooks, and it's zillions of pages of microscopic print, and you don't even know how to do it. I think, that was one of the things I was really proud of for our book, is that each chapter we deal with a topic. It's in a digestible, easily readable size.
Wide margins for notes.
Yeah.
And they are end notes, as Dr. Over might have right. So at the end of the chapter is where you'll find the notes, so they don't clutter the actual, readability of the text as you're going along.
Yeah, well, thank you. We've got one more question that I want to ask you that I'm a little off script on, but before I do, I'm just thankful. I can tell, as colleagues, I'm thankful for each of you. The art of thinking well is being lost. And I know that as we were talking about logic and reasoning and argumentation, one of the things that I tell my students is you can't just say, I believe this text says. I teach Bible classes. I believe that Exodus 4 is about, and then make a statement. You actually have to explain why. And so I've told students you can't even start with I believe anymore. Just state Exodus 4 says and then prove it. And so the ability to think and articulate is something that we have to do every day, and we don't always do it well. And so I'm thankful to you guys for that. And I want to know when you all started really being impacted by this idea of philosophy, right thinking, right articulation and argumentation, and maybe you can help us, these students and anybody watching at home, to maybe get that spark that you had.
If I'll go first. I've been thinking about this lately. It took me 5 years to finish college. And it seemed like it was going to be forever. And my goal was to become a career Army officer. I was going to go into the Army, and that was going to be my career. And so for 5 years, I selected the university I went to for the ROTC program, its reputation and all of that. And I put every ounce of my energy into striving to achieve my goal of being commissioned as an officer in the Army. And the day that I was commissioned, in a big ceremony, they pinned the gold bars on my shoulder. It was the most depressing day of my life. Because, number one, I never thought about what was next. And number two, I never considered the why question. What was the point? Why in the world was I doing this? Nobody ever asked me why. And I began to be confronted with this question, what is the meaning of all this? Why would I do this as opposed to that? What is worth my time and energy? And some of those more, very deep and fundamental questions really just sort of lit a fire under me that I think ultimately led to where I am now.
And that you should probably be thinking about.
That you all should be thinking about.
No matter how old you are, yes, yeah. Gary?
Yeah, well, there's so many different ways to answer that.
Really?
Rich has a great way of explaining his love and recognition for the value of philosophy. The answer I would give for the purpose of this audience is to don't be intimidated by how analytic and rigorous philosophy can be. That will come after more seasons with it and as you grow in your philosophical abilities. Don't forget about how philosophy is natural to who you are. One of the things that really upsets me at the beginning of the semester is how many students never had philosophy until they get to Grand Canyon or they get to college. When the reality is we grow up asking philosophical questions all the time. And so my love for philosophy was a reacquaintance with what my education prevented me from exploring. Mm-hmm. So I remember 7, 8 years of age, contemplating pure nothingness, right? And thinking about what it would be like if there was a world where nothing existed. And then I realized I'm not in a world like that. Why are there things in this world? Why does something exist rather than nothing? And then only later that I find out that that's Leibniz's question. I remember sitting in the back of my parents' Buick, probably roughly the same age. It was the station wagon with the bench that faced out the rearview mirror, had the faux wood panel on the side.
Yeah.
And I remember thinking, how do I know these are my parents? They tell me they're my parents, but what if I'm adopted? And only later that I realized that's an epistemic question, a question about evidence and justification and reasons in support of my belief. And so, I got into philosophy because after my conversion, I needed it as a recourse to deal with all the challenges that I faced from family, friends, and professors. But once I found recourse in philosophy, it also, at the same time, reignited that flame of curiosity that used to burn bright. But again, because I went to public school and I wasn't fostered to, pursue those questions and answers to them, it was just sort of reunion later on in college.
They were your parents, right?
Turns out they
Okay, all right, just making sure. All right.
Well, it turns out one of mine wasn't, so that made it even more interesting, but you'll have to talk to me separately for that one. Mine comes through a back door, so to speak. My first philosophy class was the worst class I ever remember at all in college. And I had no interest in it, and I frankly was there for ulterior motives as a 18-year-old something that had, at best, sort of a practical atheist theism. God exists, but who cares? Nobody's ever had that but me. And as I ventured beyond that course, which was basically, is the chair here or not, kind of a major focus, it took two things to happen in my life to really set me in a different direction. One was I had no interest until I was a believer, frankly, at all, in the life of the mind or what it meant to think well or live well. I was just living for me. Total subjectivism. That was it. Whatever I got was what mattered. And because of some massive number of problems in my family, multiple divorces, abuse, and all that, I was just trying to get by in life, frankly. And it was when Christ met me and was my Lord and Savior that day, years ago, as I began to think about value of life as a whole. And then it was through a backdoor called apologetics. Everybody know about what that is, right? A defense or a case for the Christian faith. I felt like I needed what I was on a Lee Strobel kind of journey, in the sense that here I was kind of almost a mad agnostic, and then become a believer and still don't have any tools. And I began to go down this journey of apologetics, and that was life-changing. And one of my first adventures in that was to go to Simon Greenleaf University, a school of apologetics, human rights, and law, and learn under some of the best, I think, apologists, and then continue that journey, and beginning to understand what it is to think well, and to do it with this underlying commitment to needing to have the support for why I believed what I believed. Paul, what was that book? Paul Little's book, Your God is Too Small, right? And how to really begin to think better about God. All of us have our views of who God is, but one has to begin to really grapple with those big questions. What do we mean when we say the Trinity? What are we talking about when we want to talk about Jesus, right? So to me, that was a great love, and that's what moved me into philosophical theology. So I came through theology and apologetics around the back door before I really engaged standard philosophical training, and that was later in my master's and then in my doctoral work. And so today, as I look back, if I were you, a student in this setting here today, and you're here for points, make up points, I want to encourage you to think, make up life in the sense of meaning and purpose in life. This is what life apologetically and philosophically and theologically should be about. How should my life, why should my life have meaning? Where does it come from? What should my purpose be? Where do I get that? To me, that's those last two chapters in our book, and it sort of weaves its way throughout the textbook too. The different chapters. Why does this matter? Who am I? And more importantly, who is God? And then what's my relationship to God?
Amen. All right, well, thank you each. We're out of time, but we'd like to give a round of applause.
Thank you. Q&A coming.
Yeah, so this is an amazing accomplishment, so congratulations. There are the first 3 sample chapters up here at front.
Yeah,
if you'd
free
like
booklets.
if you'd like one of those, or if you'd like to ask any further questions of these 3, any final instructions for us?
Just if the audience has questions, we have, 6, 7 minutes?
Sure. I mean, we can ask a couple of questions.
Yeah. You guys got questions?
Yes, sir.
Thoughts, and address it to whoever you'd like.
So the question was, if he gives this book to his non-believing friend, how would they receive it?
Yeah.
Hopefully they'll say thanks for the gift.
I mean, think about it, Gary.
Well, I mean, so there's going to be more of a Christianly way of thinking about these topics, but as Rich pointed out earlier, it's not going to be so overt and in your face to where it's going to be off-putting either. In fact, many of the chapters lay out different views that an atheist would be open to, but at the same time, they're going to be challenged in certain ways. But I think, again, the challenge is going to be not aggressive. Like, it's all the chapters are written with a sort of an ironic approach to the different disagreement that exists within the topics and questions that we address.
We have not just Christians in mind as we wrote. Well, we wrote it specifically for a wide audience and speaking to evangelical and other Christians as well as our primary but not exclusive audience by any means. So it's inviting. And we also come with the philosophy that no one does this from a neutral standpoint anyway. So if I go to Barnes & Noble's like yesterday and I see a book called Taylor Swift and Philosophy, I kind of get a pretty good idea that that's going to have a different starting point. And I'm not going to think somebody's going to be super neutral about that. No, you're going to have some commitments. And so as your non-Christian friend who may be interested, it would be like picking up any other book. Most philosophy books you find at Barnes & Noble are going to be written by probably atheists, agnostics, or people interested more in some particular person like Socrates or Marcus Aurelius, something like that. So our audience is intended to be broad and also narrowed for the sake of Christ. Like chapters 26 and 7, right? We've got meaning and purpose in life generally, and then the next chapter is for a Christian, meaning and purpose in life. So those are specifically for broad audience and specific audience.
Any other questions? Yes, sir. Yeah. So the question for those at home was, since there's a lot of chapters, in the 26 or so, can you start anywhere, or is there a flow that you have to follow in order to understand the book?
I mean, I would say the parts, we have the chapters divided into parts. Like there's a part that gathers all the logic chapters. If you're going to read those, I would say maybe read all the chapters in that one part.
Right.
There are other aspects of it where things are connected together, like we carry over definitions and the way we talk about certain things from one chapter to another. But some of it, really, I think it wouldn't be a waste of your time. If you had a specific chapter addressing a specific question, you certainly could just go right to that chapter and read it, and it'll make sense, and you'll get some information on that topic for sure.
Yeah, they're self-contained, but as a whole within that part, it probably makes the most sense. There's usually an introduction to the topic in general.
One of the worst case scenarios may be a reference to an example to a previous chapter, and you may not get it, but it won't take away from the person being able to get everything that was intended to be communicated in that chapter.
All right. Well, thank you again. Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Appreciate it.
Thanks for coming.
Thanks for coming.